My husband secretly invited my dad over while I was out, and I came home to find my 8-year-old son duct taped to a chair while they forcibly shaved off his beloved Viking hair. When I ripped the tape off, I discovered they'd burned his back to make him stop screaming. My 8-year-old son had always had extremely long hair. He loved Vikings and metal music and always wanted to look like his heroes. Nobody ever thought it was a problem until my toxic family came back into my life. They have always been a men are robots kind of family, the type to slap their 3-year-old nephew for crying. That's actually why I cut them off. When they first came back into my life, I was quick to set boundaries. My child was mine, which meant I raised him how I saw was best fit. The men weren't happy, muttering something about feminism ruining women under their breath, but eventually agreed. Unfortunately, the cracks began early. Whenever I would come over with my son, they'd make sly digs or comments about him. He's too hyperactive. He wants too much attention. He shows too much emotion. I remember going up to use the bathroom one time, and when I came down, my granddad was scolding my nephew for imitating his favorite superhero. Apparently, real men don't do that. But by far, their biggest problem with him was his hair. You'd swear his hair physically hurt their eyeballs the way they reacted to it. They'd outright tell me it was a disgrace, that he looked like a bitch, that back in their day, a kid like him would be strapped down to a chair and shaved bald. I realized I need to put a stop to it the day my son came to me asking if he really looks like a girl and if I would love him more if he shaved his hair. That was the day I contacted my family and cut them off again. That should have been that. But there was one thing I had failed to take into account: my husband. He had always been on the fence about our son having long hair, and whenever my family made comments about him, I'd always catch him agreeing, not speaking up and vocally backing up, but sitting there with that look that screams, I'm agreeing with whatever they're saying. The day I cut my family off again, we were lying again when he brought it up. Does our son really need long hair? I looked at him like he had 5 heads. Do you really need that beer every Friday? He began stammering. Exactly. I cut him off. You don't need it, but it's one beer. You like having that one beer and it doesn't harm anyone. Same with our son. He doesn't need long hair, but he loves his long hair and it doesn't harm anyone. He didn't say anything else to me, just nodded and went to sleep. Once again, I made a mistake of thinking that was that problem solved, especially because I didn't hear anything about it again for weeks. But then the worst possible thing happened. I was running some errands, and when I came home, I noticed a car in our driveway I didn't fully recognize. My mind instantly went to an affair, but that was ridiculous because I'd only been gone for an hour, and our son was in the house. And so, I cautiously made my way inside. I opened the door, and what I saw in the living room sent chills down my spine. It was my granddad, sitting there with a look like he had just done something or shown me up. I asked him what the hell he was doing here, and he said my husband had invited him. My jaw dropped, and at the same time, I heard my son scream from upstairs. Not a painful scream, but a desperate let me go kind of scream. I ran up to go get my son, and at the top of the stairs I saw it. Hair. Huge chunks of hair on the floor, with the sound of my son screaming getting closer and closer to the bathroom. I flung the door open, and rage just immediately consumed me. My husband had our son literally duct taped to a chair, and was physically restraining Nick with one hand so he couldn't move, while shaving him bald with the other hand. I walked in right as he shaved the very last of our son's hair off. My son screamed, "Mommy, help," the second he saw me, and I just lunged. I physically shoved my husband away from our son, knocking him to the ground as he tripped over his own foot. I then started undoing the duct tape that was put over my son's skin too. Peeling it off left him with painful red marks because the duct tape was extra strong duct tape, not even regular one. I remember all the while I was doing it, my husband just kept standing behind me talking about how this was the problem. How I had coddled him was the reason our son was growing up so weak, but I didn't even pay attention to him. I just took my son into my arms and brought him downstairs with me. We went out to my car where I told him to wait there for mommy. Then I went back inside and raised hell. At first, my granddad tried telling me to calm down, that my son actually asked for his hair to be shaved, but I cut him off and just yelled over him. I don't even know what I said, but it was probably something about how this was why grandma left him. Then I turned to my husband and told him congratulations. He has just won today's grand prize for being the world's biggest buffoon. His prize is a divorce, and he may collect his winnings, aka the divorce papers, as soon as I have them drawn up. He stared at me with his mouth agape like a Magikarp. He even tried to grab my arm to talk as I was leaving the house, but I was done talking. I told him I'm going to stay with my sister for now, the only one in our family who was ever normal enough to see how screwed up we all are. Adios. I backed out of the driveway with my son asking me what he did to deserve this, and when I told him nothing, he started crying, because apparently they hadn't just shaved his head. He had of course said no at first, but they wouldn't take no for an answer, and so they burned his back until he agreed. I pulled into the nearest gas station to look for myself, and when I pulled up his shirt to see for myself, all I saw was red, both literally and metaphorically. I kept checking the rearview mirror as we drove, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. My son sat in the back seat, running his small hands over his newly bald head, tears streaming down his face. The gas station parking lot felt too exposed, too public, so I pulled back onto the road and headed straight for my sister's house. The drive took 40 minutes, but it felt like hours. Every red light made my heart race, wondering if my husband would follow us. My son stayed quiet except for occasional sniffles, and I fought the urge to pull over and hold him. I needed to get us somewhere safe first. My sister Min lived in a modest 2-story house on the other side of town. I hadn't called ahead, but I knew she'd be home. She worked from home as a graphic designer and rarely went out during the day. As I pulled into her driveway, my phone started buzzing. My husband's name flashed on the screen. I declined the call and turned the phone to silent. Min opened the door before we even reached it, her eyes widening as she took in my son's appearance. She ushered us inside without a word, wrapping my son in a gentle hug while I stood there shaking. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the full weight of what had happened started crashing down on me. My son disappeared upstairs to the guest room while Min made tea. I sat at her kitchen table staring at my hands. They had red marks from where I'd gripped the steering wheel too tightly. Min placed a mug in front of me and sat down across the table, waiting for me to speak. I told her everything about the toxic comments, the boundary violations, finding granddad in our living room, and walking in on my husband restraining our son while shaving his head. Her face grew darker with each detail, especially when I mentioned the burns on his back. She stood up abruptly and went to get her first aid kit. We called my son back downstairs, and Min carefully examined the marks on his back. They weren't severe burns, more like red welts from something hot being pressed against his skin, but they were there. Evidence of what they'd done to force his compliance. Min took photos with her phone, documenting everything. The red marks from the duct tape on his wrists and ankles, the welts on his back, his tear-stained face and newly shaved head. She was methodical about it, creating a record we might need later. My phone continued buzzing on the table. 23 missed calls from my husband, 15 from Granddad, even a few from other family members who must have heard what happened. I ignored them all. That first night was rough. My son had nightmares, waking up screaming about being tied down. I slept on the floor next to his bed, holding his hand whenever he stirred. Min brought us clothes from the 24-hour store since we'd left with nothing but what we were wearing. The next morning, I knew I had to face reality. I couldn't hide at my sister's house forever. I needed to take action to protect my son. Min had already researched family lawyers in the area and made a list of the highest-rated ones. She offered to watch my son while I went to consultations. The first lawyer I met with was a woman named Victoria Chen. Her office was small but organized, with children's drawings framed on the walls from grateful clients. She listened carefully as I recounted the events, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I showed her the photos Min had taken, her expression hardened. She explained my options. Filing for divorce was straightforward, but custody would be more complex. My husband had never shown violent tendencies before, and this single incident, while serious, might not be enough to completely restrict his access to our son. She recommended filing for a temporary restraining order immediately and documenting any further attempts at contact. I left her office feeling both empowered and terrified. The reality of divorcing my husband, of potentially sharing custody with someone who had hurt our child, was overwhelming, but I had to protect my son. Back at Min's house, I found my son sitting at the kitchen table, wearing one of the baseball caps Min had bought him. He looked so small, so vulnerable. When he saw me, he asked if we were going home. There's something really odd about how the husband suddenly invited the granddad over. Like, what made him decide right then was the perfect time. The way the mom describes finding chunks of hair leading to the bathroom feels almost too dramatic, but I wonder what was really going through the husband's mind during all this. I knelt beside him and explained that we would be staying with Aunt Min for a while. He nodded, seeming to understand more than an 8-year-old should have to. My husband's calls had escalated to texts. At first, they were apologetic, claiming he'd made a mistake and just wanted what was best for our son. Then they turned angry, accusing me of overreacting and poisoning our son against him. Finally, they became threatening, saying I couldn't keep his son from him and that he'd get custody because I was clearly unstable. I screenshot every message. Victoria had emphasized the importance of documentation, and I was taking her advice seriously. I also noticed something troubling in his texts. He kept mentioning conversations with Granddad, getting advice about his rights as a father. It seemed the toxic family influence was stronger than ever. On the third day, while I was helping my son with the online schoolwork Min had arranged with his teacher, there was a knock at the door. Min checked the peephole and quickly backed away, motioning for us to stay quiet. It was my husband. He knocked again, harder this time. Then he started calling out, saying he knew we were there and just wanted to talk. My son grabbed my hand, his small fingers trembling. I pulled him close, and we sat in silence as my husband continued knocking and calling out for nearly 20 minutes. Eventually, he left, but not before leaving a note under the door. It was a letter addressed to our son, telling him how much Daddy missed him and how Mommy was being mean by keeping them apart. The manipulation was so transparent, it made me sick. Another piece of evidence for my growing file. Victoria called that afternoon with news. The temporary restraining order had been approved. My husband would be served within 24 hours and would have to stay at least 100 yards away from us. It was a small victory, but it felt huge. That evening, Min cooked my son's favorite meal, trying to create some normalcy in the chaos. He barely touched it, still adjusting to everything that had happened. As I tucked him into bed, he asked me a question that broke my heart. He wanted to know if his hair would grow back the same way, if he could still be like his Viking heroes. I assured him it would. That hair grows back and no one could take away who he was inside. He seemed comforted by this, finally falling asleep without nightmares for the first time since we'd arrived. I sat in Min's living room afterward, finally allowing myself to process everything. In just a few days, my entire life had imploded. My marriage was over, my son was traumatized, and I was essentially homeless, relying on my sister's kindness. But I'd done what I had to do to protect my child. Min sat beside me, offering silent support. She'd been amazing through all of this, never questioning my decisions or making me feel like a burden. She'd even started researching child therapists who specialized in trauma, knowing my son would need professional help to process what had happened. My phone buzzed with an email from Victoria. She'd received word that my husband had been served with the restraining order. He'd also already hired a lawyer, some friend of Granddad's apparently. The battle was officially beginning. I thought about the road ahead, divorce proceedings, custody battles, helping my son heal from this trauma. It felt overwhelming, but I knew I had to be strong. My son needed me to fight for him, to protect him from the toxic masculinity that had invaded our home. The next few days blurred together, meetings with Victoria to file divorce papers, setting up therapy appointments for my son, fielding calls from family members trying to convince me I was overreacting. Each day brought new challenges, new attempts by my husband to regain control. He started showing up at places he thought we might be. The grocery store near Min's house, the park where my son used to play, always staying just outside the restraining order distance, but making his presence known. It was intimidating, meant to make me feel watched and unsafe. Granddad wasn't bound by the restraining order, and he took full advantage. He'd call Min's house phone, leaving messages about how I was destroying the family, how I was raising my son to be weak. Min eventually unplugged the landline, but the damage was done. His words echoed in my head during quiet moments. My son started therapy with a wonderful woman named Dr. Cole. She specialized in helping children process trauma through play therapy. After his first session, he seemed a little brighter, though he still refused to leave the house without a hat. The divorce papers were filed, and my husband's response was swift. He was contesting everything, claiming I was an unfit mother who had kidnapped his son. His lawyer, clearly coached by Granddad, was aggressive in his approach. They wanted full custody, claiming I was mentally unstable and had exposed our son to dangerous feminist ideologies. Victoria Victoria warned me this would get ugly. My husband was clearly being influenced by Granddad, who saw this as some kind of battle for the soul of masculinity. They would use every dirty trick, every manipulation to try to get custody. But she also assured me that the evidence was on our side. The photos, the texts, the restraining order violation attempts, it all painted a clear picture of who was really putting our son at risk. As the second week at Min's house began, I started looking for apartments. We couldn't stay with her forever, and I needed to establish stability for the custody battle ahead. My son needed his own room, a sense of permanence after all the upheaval. The weight of everything pressed down on me constantly. Single motherhood, financial uncertainty, the ongoing legal battle, it all felt impossible some days. But then I'd see my son smile for the first time in days, or watch him tentatively touch his growing hair, and I knew I'd made the right choice. The fight was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. But I was ready to face whatever came next to protect my son from the toxic cycle that had nearly consumed him. The apartment hunting proved more difficult than anticipated. Every landlord wanted references, and explaining why I couldn't use my husband as one raised eyebrows. My son accompanied me to viewings, his baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He'd grown quieter since starting therapy, processing everything in his own way. Victoria called with concerning news. My husband had filed an emergency motion for temporary custody, claiming I'd abducted our son and was denying him access. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. She assured me we had a strong defense, but I needed to prepare for an aggressive attack on my character. That afternoon, while Min watched my son, I drove to our old house to collect some belongings. The restraining order allowed me to retrieve personal items with police escort. The officer waited outside while I gathered clothes, toys, and my son's Viking books. I found myself staring at family photos on the mantle, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. My husband had clearly been there recently. Dishes piled in the sink, beer bottles scattered across the coffee table. In our son's room, I discovered he'd thrown away all the Viking posters and metal band memorabilia. The walls were bare, painted over in stark white. Even the curtains with dragon prints had been replaced with plain blue ones. I packed quickly, my hands shaking as I folded my son's favorite shirts. In his closet, I found the hair ties he'd collected over the years, each one special for different reasons. The silver one from his first concert, the leather one I'd bought him for his birthday. I tucked them carefully into my pocket. Back at Min's house, my son's face lit up when he saw his belongings. He immediately grabbed his favorite Viking book, running his fingers over the illustrated warriors with their long, flowing hair. For the first time in days, he smiled genuinely. The custody hearing preparation consumed the next few days. Victoria coached me on what to expect, how to present myself, what questions they might ask. She warned me they'd likely paint me as an overprotective mother who'd overreacted to a simple haircut. I practiced staying calm while recounting the duct tape, the burns, the forced restraint. Min took time off work to help with childcare. She'd become fiercely protective of my son, creating art projects to help him express his feelings. One drawing showed a small figure with short hair crying while larger figures loomed over him. Another depicted the same small figure holding hands with two female figures, walking toward a rainbow. 3 days before the hearing, things escalated. My son's school called, reporting that someone claiming to be his grandfather had tried to pick him up. The secretary, thankfully, had followed protocol and refused without proper authorization. Security footage showed Granddad arguing at the front desk before storming out. I immediately contacted Victoria, who filed an addendum to our restraining order request. The school implemented additional security measures, requiring photo ID and a code word for any pickup. My son started asking why Grandpa wanted to take him, and I struggled to explain without vilifying family members he'd once loved. That evening, Min's doorbell rang repeatedly. Through the peephole, I saw my mother-in-law standing there with several gift bags. She'd never been unkind to me, but she'd always deferred to the men in the family. I watched her ring the bell again, calling out that she just wanted to give my son presents. Min handled it, stepping outside to speak with her. I watched from the window as my mother-in-law gestured frantically, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Min stood firm, arms crossed, shaking her head. Eventually, my mother-in-law left the gifts on the porch and departed. The packages contained expensive toys, all traditionally masculine. Granddad trying to pick up the kid from school without permission? That's moving from toxic family drama straight into somebody call security territory. Guess he skipped the chapter on legal boundaries in his parenting manual. Remote control cars, action figures, a football. At the bottom of one bag was a note in my husband's handwriting, telling our son that Daddy loved him and would see him soon. I photographed everything for evidence before storing it all in the garage. My son's therapy sessions intensified as the hearing approached. Dr. Cole worked with him on expressing his feelings about the haircut, the restraint, the fear he'd experienced. She taught him coping mechanisms for anxiety, breathing exercises for when memories overwhelmed him. I sat in the waiting room during these sessions, reading the same magazine pages over and over. 2 nights before the hearing, my phone rang at 3 a.m., unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Heavy breathing, then Granddad's voice, low and menacing. He talked about how I was ruining the family, destroying his grandson's future. I hung up and immediately called Victoria, who advised me to file a police report. The next morning brought another surprise. Min found an envelope tucked under her windshield wiper. Inside were photos of my son and me at various locations around town. The grocery store, the lawyer's office, even outside the therapist's building. Someone had been following us, documenting our movements. The implications sent ice through my veins. Victoria took the photos seriously, advising us to vary our routines and stay vigilant. She'd seen this intimidation tactic before in custody cases. The goal was to make me paranoid, to make mistakes that could be used against me. I refused to let them win. The morning of the hearing arrived too quickly. I dressed conservatively, following Victoria's advice. My son clung to me as Min prepared to watch him for the day. He made me promise to come back, his small voice breaking my heart. I assured him I'd never leave him, that everything I was doing was to keep him safe. The courthouse felt imposing as I walked through security. Victoria met me in the lobby, reviewing last-minute details. She'd prepared extensively, organizing our evidence into a compelling narrative. The photos of my son's injuries, the documented harassment, the school incident report.